Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, the series where I speak to people who can help us to understand the risks of human decision making and what we can do to mitigate them. On this episode, I'm returning to the subject of compliance. Now, before many of you switch off at the mere mention of the word, bear with me, because it's precisely that reaction that's at the heart of what I'm going to discuss. My guest this time, Professor David Hess, has researched how employee perceptions of an organization's compliance function impact its effectiveness. And what he's found is that if employees don't respect the organization's compliance program, then the downside isn't just that the function is ineffective. It actually creates more harm than good and leads to more unethical behavior. His paper, Chipping Away at Compliance, How Compliance Programs Lose Legitimacy and Its Impact on Unethical Behavior, explores how compliance programs can start to lose legitimacy, why that lost legitimacy leads to increased wrongdoing, and what we can do to stop it from happening. Given many of my listeners either work in compliance or in an industry that's regulated, I thought it'd be a really good idea to speak to David to find out more. So, without further introduction, let's find out more about how bad compliance is far, far worse than we might initially have thought. Please enjoy my discussion with Professor David Hess. David, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. I'm happy to be here.
Listen, I'm very excited about having you here because your area of research that drew you to my attention was sort of, I think, bang on for human risk. But before we dive into that, can you just give my listeners a little bit of sense of your area of specialism and I guess how you came to be interested in it?
All right, well, great. I'm a professor. I teach business ethics and business law here at the University of Michigan, and I've been doing this for about 20 years now. In my interest in the area of compliance as well as behavioral ethics came from more the teaching side than the research side initially. As we taught business ethics, we often think about teaching what is the right thing to do, what's the just and fair thing to do. But the more difficult challenges and the questions you tend to get from students after class is more, I face this difficult situation. How should I handle it, right? I know what the right thing is to do, but how do I actually go about implementing that? So that sort of led me into these questions on how people try to behave ethically and what's keeping them from doing the right thing. And then due to my background as a lawyer, thinking about what government regulation can do to encourage corporations to develop compliance and ethics programs that really relate to how people face pressures in work, how they think about these issues, and what we can do to really encourage corporations to think about and implement compliance programs that we think are more likely to be effective.
And before we dive into the research, I have this view that the word compliance is really unhelpful because I think it sends a hideous signal to both the people doing it, but also the people to whom it is being done, because that's often how it feels, but also to sort of stakeholders in general. Do you agree with that, or do you think that's in irrelevancy that the sort of dynamics would exist? Is this without the branding?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, and it definitely comes up all the time. Now often we add ethics and compliance together. Whether it's in the title of the officer or some of the organizations that are working in this area. Other people, I guess, have used the word integrity. Is that better? One of the ways when I teach business ethics, when I think about, when I start a class, I often start out, my job isn't to turn you from a bad person into a good person, right? If you're a bad person, there's not much I can do to help you. My assumption is that you in good faith want to do the right thing, and I'm here to give you some tools and help you think about how to do that, right? Whether it's for yourself or the people you manage, make it easier for them to do the right thing. So does integrity better capture that? Or does that cause somebody to say, well, are you saying I don't have integrity and you have to give me integrity? So I guess over time, has it become more of a term of art that people understand what compliance and ethics mean, especially if you use the two words together?
And the piece of research that caught my eye was called Chipping Away at Compliance. And if you asked me 10 years ago, would that have attracted me? I would have said absolutely not, but I clearly find it fascinating now. And when I looked at what you were looking at, I mean, it's a fascinating piece that basically says having I'll paraphrase it here and tell me where I've gone wrong, but having ineffective compliance isn't just undesirable, it's actually counterproductive. It makes things a whole lot worse. And so paying lip service to a compliance function isn't just a bad thing, it's a really bad thing.
Correct. And so, we think about all the resources, time, effort, people spent towards compliance and ethics programs, and then there's so much research. Well, in the news, we see all these breakdowns. And so it leads to this question, why? What's going on? Is it just that we aren't doing compliance and ethics correctly? Or is there something about the way that we're doing it, or problems that can develop, I guess would be the better way to say it, that actually make things worse rather than it wasn't just a waste of time and money. We actually did the opposite of what we were trying to do.
The basic thinking here is there are lots of, I'll use the term organizations, but largely we're talking about companies, but there are clearly organizations that are not companies that have compliance functions that sort of go through the motions because they have to. And logically speaking, I guess if you were just going to tick the box, if you didn't have to have a compliance function because I don't know you're not heavily regulated, you probably wouldn't bother. So what we're typically talking about here is companies that have recognized they need to have one, presumably to pacify a regulator or someone else, or to look like, and therefore they go through the motions and put something in place that's actually ineffective. And so they tick the box and have this function, but in reality, everybody knows that this thing isn't doing what it claims to be doing.
Well, I mean, so there's different ways to think of it. There can be, some companies that are sort of, I guess, misleading in that sense, right? In some part of the academic literature, we think about are companies purposely putting in compliance programs they know don't really work, and they know the regulators have no way of telling whether it works or not. So it's an insurance policy. I just have to make sure I've got enough down on paper, I've gone through enough, employees have done enough training that it checks all the boxes. And if I do get in trouble, I've done enough that I won't, the regulator will let me off more lightly. Or is it sort of the misguided in the sense of we're trying to do the right thing. We're trying to implement a compliance program, but we make an exception here, we make an exception there. And then that's, we often talk about individuals going down sort of a slippery slope where one small transgression leads to a worse, to a worse, to a worse. Do organizations face the same situation? That's why I use this word sort of chipping away. So it wasn't an intentional decision. Hey, I just want to have, I think I used the word compliance theater. I just want people looking like they're doing what they're supposed to, even though they know it's not effective. It's how do people who are actually trying to implement a compliance program, things happen that sort of chip away at sort of the legitimacy of it, meaning the employees don't really have a lot of faith that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. And then that leads to all these problems of not just ineffectiveness, but potentially devaluing all the values behind the compliance program. So it's not necessarily an intentional, hey, we're just going to go through the motions, but we've done things that are causing our program to lose legitimacy in the eyes of our employees.
And so in other words, it's set up in a manner that it could be successful, but it's just as you say, it's just sort of chipped away. So it sort of gets diverted slightly, and therefore you end up with, in very simple terms, you end up with the form but not the substance.
Correct. Exactly.
And how does that chipping away begin?
Well, in the paper, it's more, I guess, of an essay and starting to think about these questions. In your everyday life, you can imagine if there's a conflict, right, between, our rules say X, but this is more profitable to do things the other way. I think the Herbalife recent FCPA settlement, if you read through what they admitted to doing, people raised red flags about, there was one executive that, for 6 months straight was expensing 2 or 3 dinners every day. And each dinner was, several $1,000s. And people on the board of directors said, hey, this looks like there's something fishy going on here. But clearly, I don't remember if it was the audit function, but somebody said, well, no, this is within normal bounds, right? They were seeing how this was bringing value to the company. So they said, we're going to let this one slide. So that's kind of an extreme example. But, right, if you let something slide under pressure, right, then other people see that and observe that, and they start to lose faith in what the compliance program is supposed to do. And then once employees start to get too cynical that's when things can start to really go south.
And I find this interesting because it's sort of traditional approaches to compliance. So we have the function and they'll tell people what to do. And so from an organizational perspective, we're covered. And what you've depicted there, I think is really interesting. And it's kind of obvious if you look at other contexts in life, is that people can smell environments and sort of work out, is this serious or not? Am I going to get in trouble or not? And so we all go through scenarios where we kind of work out what the rules of the game are, whether we're starting a new job. In the old days when we went to offices, do I have to leave my jacket on the back of a chair to look like what are the rules of the game and how seriously do they take this and what are the consequences? And I find it very interesting when you talk about that piece, because that's what happens within organizations is people sniff out, is this compliance regime for real? Do I have to listen to what they say? Will I get into trouble if I go things wrong? How do I get my cues for that? Well, I look around me and I see what happens to other people. And maybe I test the waters a little bit. And so I find it really interesting that is so obvious, a natural tendency we all have. And yet, for some reason in the compliance world, that this hasn't been addressed. People have sort of just, accepted that the monolith of compliance is there and that we won't do those natural processes in that compliance arena, when logically, of course, we will.
Correct. And I think, a colleague in the medical school, they discovered that within medical education for doctors, which was, we tell doctors in the classroom what your professional responsibilities are, how you're supposed to interact with the other departments in the hospital. But then they discovered when they were on their rotations, actually in the hospital in the different departments, they were being taught different things just by observing the social norms, right? And so they referred to that as the hidden curriculum, right? And they're saying this is where people are really learning how to do their day-to-day job. So the same thing in compliance and ethics. We've got your ethics training, whether it's online or if you're lucky enough to have something in person. That's where you get the formal training, but then we still have to pay attention to the informal part, right? How are you actually treated? What rules do your managers or supervisors or coworkers really follow? What punishments do you receive for not following those, right? So it sort of parallels, you got the formal and the informal, and the informal parallels the formal system in having its own form of monitoring, sanctions, and so on, right? And that's where people are really learning what to do and how to do their job and what gets rewarded. And so if you don't pay attention to this sort of hidden curriculum, right, then you're missing this whole large picture of things. And so the challenge is, it's challenging enough for a compliance officer to figure out how to do that. But then also, if you have this regulatory umbrella over everything, is then how do you show that regulator in the future, look, we've addressed these issues, right? It's easier to go through something that was audited. Look, 100% of the people have taken the trainings, things like that. But how do you show them we've paid attention to these other sort of informal aspects of our culture and we've managed that well? That's another challenge that's, it's also a challenge for a compliance and ethics officer to show their supervisors, their board of directors, their CEO, hey, look, I'm being effective, right? How do you have the measure of effectiveness that you can show them as well? So there's many different hurdles there, I guess.
As you were talking, I'm always struck that sort of induction training is the kind of classic example of that, where you turn up and particularly a large firm, you'll be told a whole load of things. This is how we operate. This is how we do things. And then you'll be let loose in the wild and you'll discover that does the theory hold up? And more often than not, it gets destroyed very, very quickly, because these induction trainings go for the sort of A star in terms of ethical positioning, and they paint, it's almost like a marketing exercise to say, we will set the right tone. And then you end up with that cognitive dissonance that you've described, which is, if I have a choice between what I have been told in the classroom and what I'm seeing in reality, I'm going to go with the flow with reality. And so as you were talking, it occurs to me that when people get into trouble, they kind of double down on the saying the right thing. And such that if you're trying to solve a problem, there is a tendency towards, let's make the training even more robust and even stricter, and let's be even clearer, which, of course, if the reality isn't catching up with that, makes that gap even wider.
I think depending too on, what background somebody comes from. So there's always a question of, should compliance and ethics officers be lawyers, or should they have more of a managerial background? And that's going to influence, right? You see a problem, right? You see somebody made an improper payment. Is your perspective from a legal perspective might be, well, they didn't know the rules enough, so we need to do more training so they better understand the rules, or they weren't scared enough of punishment, so we need to increase sanctions and monitoring. versus if somebody comes from perhaps more of a managerial background or is more interested in these, sort of behavioral ethics issues, such as you talk about, they'll start to understand, well, why did this person do that, right? Your starting assumption is not this is a bad person who did a bad thing, but what were the situational factors that pressured them to do that, and how can we better manage those pressures, right? So that's going to come into play as well, is how do you approach what do you think the problem is, and what is your potential solution? That could be influenced by what your background was coming into the problem as well.
You mentioned it there is a sort of there's this interesting question around, legal and compliance. Is it the same thing? Because it's all about rules, isn't it? And I know you've got some views, which I'd love to sort of elicit to get them out in front of the listeners around whether that's an appropriate view of the world or not. I mean, for what it's worth, I think it poses huge amounts of challenge, because if you approach the compliance piece like it's a legal problem, you will build constructs that work well in court that don't necessarily work well in reality.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. We have to think about, both sort of the individual factors, right? What are the sort of biases that people bring in? Where are they more likely to mess up? As well as what are the situational factors, right, that are causing people to go down a certain path. So it's, thinking about sort of those antecedents to the wrongdoing, rather than just sort of seeing the wrongdoing and assuming that that's a bad person. We need to put in better internal controls. Again, thinking about it from these managerial perspectives, what are their incentives? What are the social pressures? Do they feel they have the ability to stand up to wrongdoing and report wrongdoing, or the pressure that they're facing, or will they just kind of give into it and rationalize that behavior and move on? So correct, thinking about it less as sort of here's the rules and, how would the law approach it, how would a prosecutor approach it, is very, very different than viewing it as a managerial problem of how can I help people do the right thing, right?
Do you think that the construct of compliance kind of is its own worst enemy? Because we create this function that if you ask the average person in business, what are those people here to do? You would get an answer that was sort of analogous to, I don't know, the people that stock the stationery cupboard, that buy the supplies for the buildings. That's what they do. They deal with this regulatory stuff so I can get on and do my other thing, in the same way that the cleaners clean the building, or the IT people solve the IT problem. So there's a little bit of a strange piece here, which is it's sort of, and not helped clearly by the way compliance often positions itself. But there is this perception that function is here to deal with this stuff, and therefore, I don't have to think about it myself. So, is the construct itself slightly flawed in terms of the message it sends to people?
Well, that's a good question. Again, I guess does it? If we put in the words, if we shift more to ethics or integrity, does that help people, or does that also create resistance? Some research shows that some executives have pushed back against compliance and ethics officers because, I don't need your help telling me how to be ethical. I'm an ethical person. What do I need you to tell me to do, right? So is it so much the label or so much the communication aspect? So it used to be, as I mentioned, I teach business ethics, and I've been doing it for 20-some years. In the 90s, even, a lot of business school deans did not think business ethics should be taught in business schools, right? We've got MBA students, they're 26, 27, 28 years old. If they don't know right from wrong now, how are we going to teach them? And that's not the right way to view it, right? It's life in business is a lot different than don't lie, don't steal, right? Your actions can have impacts on people in ways that you may not know about, right? Unless you're specifically looking for it or thinking about it, right? That's the awareness aspect. And then helping people think through, your actions could impact multiple different stakeholders. What are the trade-offs? How do I think through those questions on what's the right thing to do? What's the fair thing to do? What's the just thing to do in the situation? So, it's not as simple as here's the rules, let's follow them. It's, so is it a communication aspect of here's what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to help you handle pressures you may face in doing the right thing, helping you with if you get placed in a difficult situation where you have to report someone. I'm here to help you know how to do that or how to talk to that other person, versus I'm here to tell you what the rules are and you'll get in trouble if you break the rules. So is it less the label versus the communication of what the department's job function is and how we're here to help you and support you, right? So I think a lot of companies have done that. They don't have an ethics hotline, which is, hey, I'm reporting somebody, but it's a helpline, right? Hey, you're facing a problem. We're here to help you think through it. What is the right thing to do? What are the variables you need to think about? Who can you talk to? Those types of questions. So it's more of a messaging communication, letting people know what the Compliance and Ethics Office is here to do for you and how we can help you.
And I think that articulation is really interesting, because when you look at the sort of the way often training is done, you get trained on extremities. So if I look at financial services, there's a classic scenario here, right? We want to make sure we've taught people about money laundering and why it's a bad thing, and we don't want to be funding terror and breaching sanctions. So what we'll do is we'll come up with scenarios in training that are so extreme. It's sort of, your client has come in and their sister has appeared with a briefcase full of money. What do you do? Right? The sort of situation that's so ludicrously extreme that no one in their right mind is going to need help dealing with it, because you're going to, this is a bit weird. Okay. And so you don't need help with those extreme things. You don't need to be told that murder is bad. I don't believe there's any training that does do that, but hypothetically, and it's interesting. It's in that grey space, and actually, the way you were talking there, that it reminds me that there is an inevitability that there are going to be ethical issues coming up in business. Not because you're setting out to be unethical, but they will just arise. There will be conflicts of interest. There will be challenges. Stuff will happen where the black and white rules no longer apply. And yet we talk to people in these very black and white terms. And so we almost make people think they're weirdos for being in this grey space. And I can't go for help with that because it's not one of these black and white scenarios. So again, this is a construct of, the theoretically perfect compliance stroke ethics training that fails a practical test, because the average person doesn't need help with those things. And that probably perpetuates the dynamic you're talking about.
Correct. I mean, so when you've got to step back and think about what is our ethics training trying to do, right? On the one hand is you want to provide the knowledge, here's the rules, what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do, things like that. But we also need to help people think about, all right, if you are placed in this situation where somebody shows up with a briefcase full of money, what are you going to do, right? Or if your manager then tells, just ignore that person with the briefcase and don't report anything. What am I supposed to do, right? How do I have confidence that I know how to handle this issue, whether it's to call somebody to report it or how I need to talk to this person, right? If you don't want to turn in your coworker, you want to first start by talking with them and thinking about, what they're doing wrong, in a way that doesn't cause them to be sort of defensive, right? So having that skill is something we can also teach, right? So it's not just here's the rules, don't break them, and when you face one of these situations, and you might very well, despite our best efforts, you might face a situation, don't be surprised. Approach it like any other problem you would, right? Take that sort of a mindset, and do what you can do to sort of handle. We can help you figure out how to think through these things. So Mary Gentile has a book and a whole approach called Giving Voice to Values, which is one excellent framework for saying, well, how can I talk to somebody about these questions and these problems, right? So to the extent that ethics training can do that, give you the skills to handle these things, it's going to be much more successful than sort of just running through these scenarios that you talk about. But of course, there's also the resource side, right? It's very easy to have simple online training where everybody takes and you can reach the whole department versus sort of a face-to-face, what we would do in a business ethics classroom, for example, at a university, right? Where we can actually do case studies and role plays and things like that. That's going to be a lot more intensive. So perhaps if a business is more selective on who gets certain types of training, that might be one way to handle it. You have a mixture of sort of the best of both worlds if you can. And
I mean, that point around resources and the cost of kind of doing this properly. I mean, one of the things I found interesting as reading your research and sort of thinking about it is these ineffective compliance functions. It's not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. So once you've built this architecture up, if you're in an industry where you need this, then it's an expensive game, whatever. And therefore, it's an astonishing piece that sort of says, actually, if you were to compare the effectiveness of your compliance program versus your marketing program, you would scrutinize your marketing program for effectiveness. You say, why are you spending all this money on this advertising? It's just not working. But for some reason, we don't do the same thing with compliance. We don't think about it in those terms and sort of say, is this actually, am I getting good bang for buck here? And yet it's a heck of a lot of money. So there's a lot of talk around how expensive compliance functions are, but people don't look at it in terms of effectiveness in a way that they would if they were deploying that money to persuade someone in a different context.
Well, and I think that's one of the challenges that chief ethics and compliance officers face, right, is how to prove that they're contributing value to the company, right? I mean, part of the value that they contribute is the avoidance of sort of regulatory infractions, as well as sort of the development of a sort of a toxic corporate culture, which is going to have other impacts within the organization, right? If employees don't feel that they're being treated fairly, they're going to act in ways that are less productive, obviously. And so it's harder to show that avoidance problem, right? I think one compliance officer mentioned, sort of a similar problem that a lighthouse operator faces, right? How do you prove that you were effective in preventing ships from crashing into the wall? And so to the extent that, ethics officers are starting to develop metrics that can show this effectiveness and how training is working, that's going to go a long ways. Potentially getting, more resources if they're not getting the resources they feel they need, as well as increasing their legitimacy within the organization. It's easier to prove, hey, look, I'm effective. This is what we've done. Then their value is more established, right? To the extent they haven't been able to do it, that's caused them to lose some legitimacy, as well as potentially losing resource allocation.
I find it interesting when we look at sort of the way these functions manifest themselves and the way they go about doing the task, but also the demonstrating the value add piece, is that we have people stepping into the compliance and ethics space who understand the rules or have a sense of what ethics is about, and therefore can add value in that in a technical sense of it. But actually, we're not generally bringing people in that are thinking in the terms that you've just outlined, which is sort of, how do I sell myself? Because if you're naturally a salesperson, that's probably not the function you're going to be heading towards, because you'll go towards something that has a sales title. One of the things I think is interesting, and I'd be very interested to get your views on, is the skill set that you need in these compliance and ethics functions. We traditionally hire for what it says on the door. We don't necessarily hire for the actual practical skills. So it's a sort of theoretical, they're really good with rules, so we'll put them in compliance. Or they seem to have a good ad. But actually, there's a whole load of other skills to make the function successful that are never hired. So communication skills would be a good example, particularly in the current environment, where if you're not a terribly good communicator face-to-face, I don't think you're magically going to develop the skills to do it online. But we're not hiring people in that space. And I think that's almost putting them in a really unfair position, because they're being hired on a skill set that isn't necessarily what they need to deliver to deal with some of the problems you've outlined.
Correct. I mean, I think that's why, some of the different compliance officers organizations have, mentioned that, we need to move away from the legal perspective, having just hiring people, this is rules, so you need to have lawyers doing this type of job, versus people who have that managerial background, who are thinking about, what are the incentives people are facing. It's not just, as we just talked about, if somebody messes up, you don't just say, well, they didn't know the rules, or they weren't scared enough of punishment, so we need to give them more trainings and make them more scared. But hey, why did they do this? What were the incentives pushing them in a certain direction? What are the social norms we mentioned earlier that are causing people to go in this direction instead of, doing what we taught them to do in training? So exactly, thinking about what skill set you need in that position, right? What managerial skills they need, and then giving them the authority to do that, right? To look at these corporate culture issues and not have these turf wars with, say, the human resources department, where they say, well, no, that's going to impact productivity, so that's our area, you need to stay away. So again, that's why the compliance function needs more legitimacy within the organization. What they're doing is important, and they need the resources to do what they should do. If we don't, then, is it going back down to the successful compliance and ethics officer is the one who's able to establish a good network and is better able at the marketing communication skills, doing things that they shouldn't have to do, right? The organization should already lift up the compliance ethics function and give them that legitimacy they need to do their job, versus having it be dependent on that officer to spend half their time selling themselves and selling their functions and selling the importance of what they contribute to the organization.
And it's interesting you depict it in that way, because I sort of, as you were talking, I was thinking, it is a little bit about hustling. So if in that scenario that you've described, it's kind of, can they make it work in spite of the structure? So they haven't been given the seat at the table. They don't have the influence. They don't have the reporting line. How do they make that work? And you sort of end up in a slightly sort of hustly guerrilla warfare thing, which is, how can I get around the constraint to the structure? And it is fascinating, because I think there's lots of people that I would hold out to be really good compliance officers. And as you were talking, I was thinking, actually, the reason they're really good compliance officers is they kind of, and this is an irony here, they get around the rules, right? They're getting around the structure that's been imposed on them. Not in a bad way, but often in very creative ways that sort of illustrate that they are compensating something. And if you could empower them to do it properly, they could be a hell of a lot better. But they're not, because they're spending their whole time with one hand tied behind their back.
Correct. And so in that article you mentioned that I wrote, I proposed a couple different things. One, should corporations have a compliance committee, right? Should that be, if not mandated, but taken into account within the organizational sentencing guidelines? Which again would elevate sort of the importance, show the whole organization that we view this as an important function. It gives it that legitimacy. It ensures that there's people on the board who are knowledgeable about these topics and actually spending time on these topics. I think there was a quote in an article I read recently where typically the board more overlooks compliance than oversees compliance. So it's just one way to help avoid that.
It's not, just to be clear, it's not great as a concept. It's great as a phrase, right?
Yeah, I can't remember where I read that one. But so, this would help sort of avoid some of those problems. And then it would, if you have the compliance and ethics officer report to that committee, right? Again, that elevates the importance and status that people see that, right, within the organization. They don't see this as somebody who, they report to the CEO. If the CEO is doing something wrong, right, that ethics officer is clearly not going to report him or her. So again, that delegitimizes that position right away, right? So those are a couple things that, companies should think about, regulators should think about to try to help us get over some of these hurdles that we're seeing.
And that's a really good point, because that happens naturally with audit, where you have an audit committee and they must be independent, because we wouldn't want them to be compromised in any way, shape or form. And you're absolutely right. For compliance, those same rules don't apply, which is kind of reporting to the CEO, which I think is also interesting from not just from the perspective of they're not going to call their boss out, but there's also an interesting thing that sort of says, if compliance is telling me to do one thing and I'm getting a steer from the CEO, either intentionally or I'm just picking up a signal that he's more interested or she's more interested in profitability, then I can naturally override that, because that's their boss. So they take their marching orders from up here. So what you've pointed out is it makes perfect sense. We apply it to audit. So the people that will discover things after the event, right, we want them to be independent. The people that are involved on a day-to-day basis who might discover things before it becomes a big issue, they don't need to have that independent. And I think that's bizarre, now that you point it out. I don't know why we think that's okay for audit but not for compliance and ethics.
Correct, exactly, and making sure that it's more part of the board's job as well, right? And that's just part of their oversight aspect, having that independence, not being told, if you've identified a problem, don't look too hard at that problem, right? Those are legitimate concerns that happen all the time. So what can we do to sort of short circuit those, which would all be potentially effective?
And are there any companies that are doing this effectively? Because that again, it's one of those lovely revelations. Once it's pointed out to you, it's blindingly obvious. But I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. Are there companies out there doing this well, or are you floating an idea that is quite radical and we're some way off?
I hope it's not very radical in that sense. Just off the top of my head, I guess I focus more on we see more, right? We've got availability bias, what we read about in the newspapers or when things go wrong, versus the companies that are able to change and implement and do these different things. So off the top of my head, I can't think of a good example.
My sneaking suspicion is there probably aren't any, because I don't think anyone has reflected on it in that way. But I do take your point that newspapers tend not to write stories about functions that are working well and functions that aren't working quite so well. I mean, obviously, part of the reason compliance functions operate in the way that they do is because they are responding to that extrinsic pressure from a regulator. So there's sort of an extreme issue. We have a compliance because they tell us we have to have one, and we'll call it compliance to keep them happy, and we'll structure it in the way they want us to structure it, and we'll kind of dance to their tune. And so we don't really think. Is your sense that regulators are helping and thinking in these terms, or have they got to get to that point where they're starting to reflect on the effectiveness in the way that you've just outlined?
Well, I mean, regulators, it seems, in general, at least the areas that I look at, seem to give companies a fair amount of flexibility, right, on how they do things, right? If you look at, the organizational sentencing guidelines and the Department of Justice guidance they give to companies, there's still a lot of freedom within there to do that. They want companies to ask these questions, though, of, is this risk-based, right? There's a difference between, hey, everybody takes the same training. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Are you finding areas where you face the greater risk and you're devoting more attention to those areas? Are you attempting to determine if your program's effective? What are you doing? Why do you think that's the right thing to do? So I think in general, there seem to be more sort of the higher principles, and companies still have a lot of freedom within that to try to figure out, how should we do this? What's the best way of doing it? And then, of course, there's always the challenge then, if you do get in trouble, how do you show a regulator that we really did put in an honest, good faith effort to try to implement our compliance program? That always has to be in the back of somebody's mind as well, not just how are we doing and is it effective, but also how could we potentially show an external body that we were doing our best, which raises probably different types of challenges.
And one of the things I've seen quite common, this may be hugely tainted by financial services, the industry that I know pretty well, but there is this sort of idea that we'll have a look at, there's almost a sort of social proof piece around how you run compliance, which is let's see what everybody else is doing. And then we don't want to be too far outside the pack. So we'll mold ourselves that piece. And then you get this lovely dynamic of consultants coming in. And so what they have told firm A to do is best practice. So rather than it being we'll do what everybody else is doing, we're copying best practice, but you're not actually. You're just copying what everybody else is. So that because there's safety in numbers, and if your compliance program doesn't seem particularly radical compared to, that's a great piece of defensive decision making. Because if you go off the reservation and it goes wrong, the reason people assume it went wrong is because you went off the reservation.
Correct, and then it gets to this problem. Lauren Edelman refers to the managerialization of the law, which is companies are given that freedom to determine what compliance means, but they may do so in a way that creates the least friction with other business goals, right? Her research was in the area of employment discrimination, so we might have certain sexual harassment training, EEOC type office. But even if they're not shown to be effective, as you said, everybody else is doing it, so we're all doing it. And then an external body, whether it's a judge or a regulator, says, well, everybody's doing it, so that must be the right thing to do. So we see how these ineffective practices sort of end up becoming the best practices. And the challenge is, well, how do we head that off, right? So having companies figure out how do we demonstrate effectiveness might be one way. Once we get better thinking about that, right? What metrics make the most sense, and are those metrics the right ones for your organization? So trying to get companies to think more individualized, what really works for us in our situation, and how can we talk about that effectively, would hopefully get around some of these problems of, hey, we're just doing what everybody else does, and so, this must be fun. You're afraid to experiment if, as you mentioned, your experimentation, what you thought in good faith was the right thing to do, ends up going south. In hindsight, it looks like, you weren't really trying your best. So how do you communicate that with external parties?
And I'm sorry, you're talking about metrics, and I think it's fascinating because when you look at, how, back to the sort of how do you prove a negative? We stopped all these things from happening, or prove it. Well, I can't really. But what I can prove is everybody's done this training, right? Therefore, tick that box. And so I see a lot of work to be done around the metrics, as you say, because it's very tempting to measure what is measurable. And you go even further than that. You actually do things because they are measurable. So it's almost the metrics are driving the activity, because you go, that would be a good thing that I can put down in my sort of dashboard or report that we've done. So let's go do that. because that's even so. It's not even just a case of grabbing the data that's there. It's let's go chasing, and it's not people consciously thinking in these terms, but that's sort of where you end up. Is let's go find some stuff that will allow us to fill our report so that we can make everybody feel happy. And that drives it. So I think this point around the metrics and what they are is really interesting, and is to my mind is driving some quite interesting behaviors, because one, that drives the behavior within the function, but secondly, it drives clearly those metrics are designed to drive a perception. And that, again, then has a reverberative effect that makes it worse. So I wonder what your thoughts were on how one sort of deals with that.
Correct. And we see that same problem in many different areas, right? ESG, environmental, social governance issues, and investing, that's been the news, at least in the U.S. a lot recently, based on some government regulations. And it's the same thing, right? A lot of companies will try to prove that they're environmentally friendly by finding metrics that are easy to audit and easy to show somebody else. And that's what we do to demonstrate that we're environmentally friendly, or that we're respecting human rights, even though they're not really the best ones to measure exactly what you're doing. They're just the easiest data to collect. So in compliance, how many people have taken training? Maybe you have a knowledge-based thing. But is that really getting at the social norms and cultural aspects, which we all know are so important for actually influencing individuals' behavior? So you can do things by, there's been a lot of work by Tom Tyler and others on how important procedural justice is within organizations. Do employees feel they have a voice? Do they feel they're treated fairly? This causes, them to believe that the organization's values matches theirs, and they're more likely to comply with the rules and the law. So there are ways we can measure that, right? Employee perceptions of, are they treated fairly? Do their voices heard? The question, though, is when the company has this data that may present them in a bad light, right? If you can show you've improved over time, hey, that's great. But if that first survey shows you in a bad light, you don't necessarily want to have that data laying around, right? So that's another hurdle, right? What do you do with that information? Is that information that the government could have access to or should have access to if problems develop later? Is it privileged? Those are types of questions we need to deal with as well, right? How do we encourage companies to develop metrics that matter and they can use to actually improve themselves? But we also need to think about what incentives they might have to not produce that information. So going forward, that would definitely be something that we should all think about.
Coming back to your sort of chipping away at the compliance function and the sort of erosion of its authority, are there ways that people can claw that back? Is it typically? I mean, it would seem to me that if you're going down that road, it's very difficult to recognize you're going down that path until something blows up. And it's sort of a little bit like, we need some wildfires to clear everything out, and then maybe we can start again. Are there ways that you've seen that people can kind of pull back from the slippery slope and recognize it as it's happening? Or is it something that we typically recognize when it's gone wrong with the benefit of hindsight?
Well, the hope would be, right, if you do some of these sort of surveys or, smaller group discussions where you try to get at this sense of the ethical climate of the organization. How do employees perceive the compliance function, perceive how they're being treated, how their managers talk to them, all of these different sort of corporate culture type issues. That would be, to the extent that we're doing that, then the idea would be we could identify the problem before it's too far gone, right? And that you can develop interventions earlier on. That would be the ideal hope, right, is to recognize a problem before it goes too far down, figure out what the appropriate intervention might be, whether it's certain managers that are causing the problems, whether our incentive system is pushing people in a certain direction, whatever the case might be, implement an intervention and then monitor that to see if that has improved things or if that has changed things. That would be one way to deal with it.
And so that's really... and I love this stuff because I think it's fascinating, but that's really conducting behavioral experiments around the effectiveness of compliance, right? It's sort of saying we will treat this thing as work in progress. And I think one of the things that's interesting there in traditional structures is you kind of go, we've got this nailed down. We have our rule book, so that's very clear. We have our training, so we're very clear on that. And then we have our controls. And we will test using traditional metrics whether those things are working. So is the rule book fat enough? Is the training long and boring enough? Is the control tedious and dull enough? That sort of stuff tend to be the sort of approach. So it's a very audited approach to those things on the presumption that those architectural building blocks are correct. And what you've just outlined is a completely different approach, which sort of says, we don't know what's working here and what's not working well. So we need to be probing and testing this thing the whole time. Back to my analogy, in a way that we would an ad campaign or something else that involved human reaction. But it's very much painting compliance as work in progress as opposed to a finished article. And that seems to me to be the way a lot of people look at it and go, we're almost done with that. We might have to deal with a new regulation, but the basic artifact and the architecture we put in place, that's fine. We just need to check that's working the way we thought it was. But what you're talking about saying is really, here's a radical thing. You really need to be monitoring this as if you're running a laboratory.
Correct. Just as you said, right, you can't think about, all right, we've got our compliance program in place. Our job here is done. Let's go to the bar. It's a dynamic process. It's always going to be changing, right? As new people enter, some people leave. That's going to influence as you change your incentive program, as you develop new products, whatever the case might be. There's always things that are changing internally than external pressures. And that's going to have an impact, right, internally on what's going on. So you can't just treat it as we've got everything in place. Our job is done. We can just kind of go on cruise control. But you always have to be monitoring and looking for, are things coming out of place, right? Wells Fargo may not be the best example. It's kind of extreme, right? But when people discovered that employees were engaged in this cross-selling, signing up customers for products they didn't want or never said that they gave their approval for, when that was identified, the compliance function, they said, well, that's just a bad person. We'll fire them and just leave everything else as it is, right? And that's a temptation for many organizations. Theirs was just on a much larger scale, right? That's a very different perspective. Don't jump immediately to that's a bad person. We're making lots of money. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. But thinking about, well, why did that person do it, right? And obviously, once they saw many people were doing it, they clearly knew what was going on. But right, in other organizations, when it's not that extreme, right, you've got to take that different perspective. Why is this person engaged in this behavior when, hey, they worked here for 2 years beforehand and they didn't do this? They didn't immediately become a bad person. What's causing them to go down this direction, right? And so to the extent you have, your feelers out there, you've got ways to sort of try to identify these problems before they get too big. And then you can think about, well, what changed? What can we do to try to improve this problem? What's the intervention that's appropriate? And then, of course, monitor that intervention to see if it really is working or not.
As you were talking, it reminds me of something that I quite like to do, which is, if you want some feedback on where you are likely to get breaches of rules, is go talk to the target audience about what irritates the hell out of them. I always phrase it in a particularly extreme way and sort of go, what really pisses you off? Because I'm not interested in the stuff that's slightly irritating. I'm interested in the stuff that's really annoying, because you can bet that if you get a visceral reaction to that, guess what they're going to be trying to be doing to get themselves out of this thing. And I think it's interesting that we sort of look at effectiveness and going, did that work? I'll observe the experiment from afar and go, did that work out? Yes, they seem to be doing what we wanted, a bit like we would do with animals or chemicals or something. Whereas actually we can ask human beings a little bit. I mean, we've got to be careful about the nature of the feedback we get, but it always astonishes me that we're not using that rich resource, which is, what does this feel like to go through? And so we can do it through the context of surveys, but I always think it's interesting. We don't get people, saying, if you're getting lots of inquiries about this policy, or even lots of people looking at that policy online, why are they looking at it? Right? Presumably they're not looking at it for fun. They're looking at it because they're either trying to arbitrage it, or it's totally unclear. And I think it's really interesting that we don't take those feedback points of the end user and recognize what their behaviors are around it to give us some sense of how they might be perceiving it.
Correct. I mean, so it sounds like part of, you're talking about is, this data collection, right? It's much easier now to, as you said, hey, are the lots of people clicking on this part of our policy all the time? Does that mean it's not clear, or these issues are coming up? Sort of using that data to try to help figure out what's going on is definitely something that, we're able to do much easier now than we could, 10, 15, 20 years ago. The other aspect, as you're talking, I was thinking about is the leadership level has a very different view of the world than at the line level, right? And, recognizing how you need to get that input from the people at the line level or the manager level, and what is their perception of how, your hotline program or helpline program is working, any of those things, right? They're going to have a very different view and perspective than from the leadership level, right? And so that's another reason why you really need to collect this data and get these perspectives on what's really going on, right? As you said, if you're just looking at, well, they seem to be following the rules, everything must be okay, you may not be getting the sense that, things are just about to burst, right? Things are getting worse. And if you were to go down there and get the right data, talk to the right people, you could have seen these red flags earlier on and headed it off. But instead, from your perspective, everything seems fine. I don't need to do anything, right? And there's a lot of research backing that up as well, that the leadership has a very different view than people further down the line. And you have to recognize you have that blind spot, and you need to get the data to determine what's really going on.
On that note, I've always thought it's really interesting because if you look in, particularly in larger organizations where there's greater pay disparity, you can end up with a situation where the rules that really irritate the senior people will be things like conflicts of interest and entertainment and those things that require you to have wealth or networks and the sorts of things you have after years of working. The things that will irritate people at the junior end of the spectrum are sort of piddly little controls. They're not going to be too worried about blowing expense limits because they're not in that game. So they're worried much more on operational things. And I found it really fascinating when you talk to CEOs, we have a very robust compliance, and they're basing that on the fact the things that impact them personally, the conflict of interest policy feels rigorous to them. So they make a presumption everything else is okay. They're not spotting that the junior people are suffering in hell because the processes you've got those junior. And of course, I've seen smart compliance people go, we need to make sure that our conflict of interest, our shared dealing process, all those sorts of things that the senior people will have to go through, that feels super slick and efficient so that they're not irritated, because that is our marketing spiel to them. And so I think there's something interesting there. So how do I avoid grief from the CEO? Make sure that either I craft my rules in a manner that he or she won't be upset, or I go the other way and I make it look super rigorous so I look like I'm on top of the agenda. That doesn't tell you what's going on the ground. And so I think it's interesting when you talk about those, is that sort of, which rules do people care most about? It's the ones that stop me doing what I want to do, particularly if it impinges on my personal life.
Correct. Yeah, I guess the other thing that I was thinking about, just as an example, was there was some data, I think it was the Ethics and Compliance Initiative survey on whistleblower programs. And if you look at the executive level, there was 95% satisfied. Everything's working. If I call, there's a problem, everything's solved. But then as you go down each level, that level of satisfaction gets worse and worse and worse, right? Down to the line level where they say, I report something and I don't hear back, or I don't believe what they tell me coming back. So it's just, there can be such a huge disparity between the different levels of leadership within the organization that, you really have to be aware of these different perspectives, consciously aware of it, and consciously seeking out the data that you need, getting the perspectives you need to determine, what's working and what's not. You can't just rely on your own perspective, which I think we tend to do, right? I don't see a problem, so I don't see a need to investigate, versus, making sure you've got the information to determine are things working or not.
And I think you guys have the same show, this Undercover Boss, where the CEO of companies go and sort of pretend that they're something, they get disguised and they go and see what's life like on the ground. And what's interesting there is that they look at operational issues in these shows, but the compliance never gets a look, partly because it probably doesn't make great TV, to be fair. But it's interesting that it's sort of, you might look at sort of, I don't know, you might go, you're running a manufacturing business, you might go and look at the fact, do they have clean bathrooms, and what's the food like for the people, and are there things that are difficult for them operationally? But it's interesting that there's never any sort of great exploration around those ethical topics and the things that people are facing in that space. And that occurs to me might be an interest. I'm not suggesting that every single CEO goes undercover to try and break the rules in their own organization. But that sort of shows you that it's not particularly high up on the list of priorities because people don't think about it in those terms.
In the sense of what are the ethical issues that the people at the operational level are facing on sort of a day-to-day basis? What are the challenges they're facing? Getting that perspective versus sort of the top-down, these are the rules I need people to follow.
Right.
without thinking about, well, what are the pressures on somebody to go against those rules? Or if they want to follow the rules, are the social norms such that, they're getting punished, right? My numbers aren't as good as somebody else because I followed the rules and I see that they're getting promotion. I'm not, so I'm a sucker for following the rules. I'm not going to do that now. Getting that perspective, correct. You're not just going to get that from the top looking down. You've got to be on the ground and seeing what people are seeing, feeling the pressures that they're feeling. And this, again, going back to that idea of a hidden curriculum, understanding how they're taught to do their jobs. Is that consistent with the values that the organization is trying to put forth or not?
Wow. Look, the time has just flown by, so we're almost out of time. And I just wanted to pick your brains. What's on your radar at the moment, and where are you going next in this agenda?
The idea of business and human rights has really taken off since the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights came out around 2011. And then now in Europe, a lot of countries, starting with France, have adopted these sort of mandatory human rights due diligence programs. And so human rights due diligence is this idea of companies proactively going out and looking at their operations, both domestically and abroad, to see, are we having a negative impact on human rights, or do we have the potential to have a negative impact on human rights, not just through our own operations, but those we are directly linked with. And so mandating companies to have these due diligence process seems to me very similar to the same issues we're struggling with compliance programs, right? And so what are the lessons that we can take from compliance programs and what's worked, what hasn't worked, and can we use that to try to figure out how to better implement human rights due diligence as a mandatory regulatory required activity?
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean, huge potential there, as you say, because you could the potential for just doing something that ticks a box that doesn't deliver, and as you say, making the same mistakes that have been made before. Absolutely huge. That's amazing. Wow. Well, I will be keeping an interested eye on that. That's fascinating stuff. Look, thank you so much for your time. That just flew past. So many more things I'd love to talk about, but I will point my listeners in the direction of your research pieces by putting links into the show notes so they can find out more about that. But thank you so much for, the work you've done, because I find it incredibly stimulating. And as I said to you, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I wouldn't, but I really do now.
Great. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to David for appearing and to you for listening. You'll find a link to his research chipping away at compliance in the show notes. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the platforms. Any listeners who really like the show, please do leave a 5-star review wherever you get your audio content. It really does help other people to find the show and for me to continue to attract high quality guests. I'll be back with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast very soon indeed. In the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.